Today, we're really excited to host Design as Language. Words are pretty awesome. They're pretty important. They're really a critical component in designing experiences and engaging with your audience. And this makes UX content strategy and writing a really powerful tool for shaping products and potentially shaping our future. So we are really excited today to have some experts in this field to share their perspective and experience in the world of language. We have Maggie Stanfill, who is a UX director at Google. She has shaped Google's products through language and is one of the co-founders of the UX content strategy discipline at Google. So she's really been leading the charge here. She's also created brand and voice and writing guidelines. And prior to Google, she led content strategy at places like Expedia, Razorfish, Nike, places like that. And with her today, we have Jocelyn Cooper, who is a senior content strategist with Maggie on her team. She's been working in PR and communications at Google and other places beforehand. She's a little bit of a lit nerd and a podcast enthusiast, and we're excited to have them both. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We're super excited to talk about language. So we'll share with you our approach to language at Google within our design process, and we'll leave some time at the end, so hopefully if you have questions, we can get into that. All right, so let's get started. I'm Maggie, and I already had a great intro from Kai. I work on shopping, travel, and payment, some of our commerce products. And as Kai said, I manage a team of content strategists as well as a community and culture team.
And hi, I'm Jocelyn, and I'm a writer and designer on Google Shopping, and I'm on Maggie's team. So yeah, as Maggie said, we're going to talk about the importance of copy and language in crafting product experiences. But to get there, we want to look at the wider role of language and culture through some examples from art and literature and politics. And we're hoping that these examples will make it really self-evident why considering the copy in your product is so important.
So for me, considering copy has always been part of what I do, and I had the great privilege to work in editorial starting out in my career, worked for great publications like Condé Nast Traveler, thought a lot about the art and copy coming together and telling a story. And I found that this translated really well later in my career at places like Nike and Razorfish, and ultimately has found its way into tech. So it's been super fun to think about how this all works. So as we said, we're going to talk about some ideas, some principles, some practice, and ultimately we hope you can bring this back to your day-to-day. So this screen from the 2017 Year in Search video, which we put out every year, is such a great indication of the importance of the relationship between the content and the design. And ultimately, at the center of this is the user's query. That's a big part of Google search, is being responsive to the user's needs. And in fact, the query then becomes the design itself. And we see this more and more with conversation design and the assistant and a lot of those new interaction modes. When we think about language, we think about it as a core component of the design system, and ultimately, design is communication. So these are kind of inextricably linked. And I love this Project Phi image and art. It all comes together in a really playful way, and I think it's a great example of the harmony that we need to strike with language and copy, and to ultimately tell the right story.
So I've always been really fascinated by typographic art, or art that kind of features type and copy prominently. And here are some examples of Debbie Millman's work, and you might be familiar with her. She's a designer and writer, and she kind of works really fluidly between those two mediums. But I think what I like about these is you can kind of think of them as visual poetry or visual literature. Because the artist's intention is communicated as much through the actual semantic meaning of the words that they choose, but also through kind of the more visceral reaction that you have to how they're rendered visually. So speaking of visceral, depending on how you feel about a certain four-letter word in this ad, you might be inspired or incited, or you might be totally put off. And so I think that the writer and their client probably were very aware of this when they made this choice. So this ad was meant to be for an organization that organizes volunteer trips to go to Africa and build homes. So, their digital agency was probably taking a bet that by using language that was really provocative, they would probably kind of filter out the people who weren't appropriate for such a mission. So then similarly, on another note, like seeing the words "I love you" in large type on a screen like this, like some of us can almost get sort of a physiological reaction to them because the way these words are said and whether they're said in familial and in romantic relationships, it's so deeply ritualized. And these words have such a like personal and intimate connotation that, they just really deeply like and clearly illustrate the power of language. So for that reason, because these words are so powerful, when I see something like this, I bristle a little bit. And I'm pointing out in particular where it says "stores you love delivered." And this is a Google product. This is from Google Express. And, I feel like a couple years ago in marketing, it was kind of en vogue to use the word love. It was kind of, dropped around a little bit glibly. But even, if I think about, the way that I feel about the products that I might buy on Google Express or like things that I might buy for my home, like, soap or dishwashing detergent, I wouldn't necessarily equate them to something that I love. So, just dropping these words into certain scenarios without consideration of their context is not necessarily a shortcut to eliciting that real emotion.
So we've been eliciting emotion through language for hundreds of thousands of years as a species, and this skill has very much come to form us as humans. And when we look at that, I think it's just another way to kind of underscore the importance of language is critical to any design system, right? This is the most inherent design system that we ultimately know. So amazing person who I've admired my whole life, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is one of these masters of this craft. And I think when looking at this diagram of his sentence, which some of us lit nerds geek out on, you really get the impact of the visuals that language can bring. And in this one sentence, you understand that this man inhabits a world where discovering ice is something to behold and quite miraculous, and that he will one day face down his death. So just another amazing example of the structure and the semantic nature of language brought to life. For something a little bit more everyday, we have a couple conversation design applications here. So our Google Assistant product, as well as the messaging app Allo. And one of the really cool things that I see happening with conversation design is that at the center of the design itself is language, which is an amazing pattern to work on. One of the things that I am super excited about is the fact that conversation is becoming central to the design culture, and ultimately, conversation has been part of culture for a very long time. In fact, there was a period in French history called the Age of Conversation, where people got together and they talked in salons and they established the social kind of mores of the day. And ultimately, this is what became the norms and the language used in that day and age. And by a somewhat stark contrast, today we have emojis oftentimes kind of standing in for those social norms. And we see, they have quite a lot of weight, in fact. If people like a certain story, it might be more read in a news feed. And ultimately, the thing that falls flat with emojis, as fun and clever and even animated as they are, is they just don't quite get the nonverbal cues, which I think all of us really need in life to really connect with people. Such as this amazing one by another hero, Daniel Day-Lewis, in Phantom Thread. Nods, gestures such as even blushing or winking or smiling are hugely important in actually making a connection and getting your communication across.
So speaking of both verbal and nonverbal cues, this journalist Julie Beck, and for a recent article in The Atlantic, interviewed N.J. Enfield, who's a professor of linguistics, who has a new book out called How We Talk. And so the interview and also the book is primarily about these traffic signals, as he calls them, that we use to kind of coordinate how we use language. So he calls these traffic signals, they're essentially the filler words, the hms and the ums and the pauses that we all use to kind of bridge our conversations. And it's actually, I found this really fascinating, a pause of longer than 200 milliseconds in spoken conversation is really atypical, it's kind of rare. Because most of the time what we're doing is we're listening and we're already constructing what the person who we're listening to is going to say and formulating our response. And that way conversation follows at a relatively rapid clip. But these pauses of 200 milliseconds, these hms and ums and just like considered silences, they usually indicate that the speaker is kind of maybe thoughtfully preparing to deliver bad news maybe, or that they're just giving some time and consideration to their response. But it doesn't always have to be bad, these pauses. So I think of this conversational white space, like it has a metaphor in design, and that is actual white space. And so the Google search box can be seen as kind of like a considerate pause that allows you a little bit of time to conjure up your query. So another way to think about conversational white space is the interplay between the copy and the design and allowing you the space that you might need to consider what your next step is. So in the example from Airbnb, if you're familiar with the paradigm of booking hotels and that's just how you travel, you might not have a concept of what a shared room is. So you kind of need to stop for a moment and think and like process, what does that mean? And if from the example from Google Wallet here, the white space is kind of acting as a focusing function because you're about to take on what is essentially like a pretty serious, potentially, transaction. You need to focus because you're thinking about money. So toward the end of 2017, I read a couple of articles that identified content-first design as one of the key trends of 2017. And of course, the term content-first design is not new. It's been around for many years now. But I think that maybe it's not so much a debate of whether content comes first or design comes first, but rather like a conversation about how we can ensure that the both are developed in tandem. Because if we really think about like what is content, like it's essentially everything. For the purposes of this presentation, we're really talking about the words, like the copy that are in your web page or your app. But it could be data, it could be numbers, it could be images and video, it could be a great many things. And so really the design and the information that's being designed are inextricable. They're totally intertwined. So with that end, next we're going to go over a couple of principles to help ensure that the design process that you undergo considers copy within the context that it should be presented, that it's consistent, and that the style is thoughtful and appropriate for whatever situation or app or experience you're designing for.
Awesome. So we established earlier that we won't necessarily say I love you on a first date, but similarly, we need to think about that when we kind of meet the customer or the user for the first time or the 10th time, right? So having that kind of context-aware approach to language and to our content strategy is really critical to meet the user where they're at in their journey and hopefully provide them with the right information. So as I said earlier, some of my areas that I work on are shopping and travel. And in the commerce space, we see a pretty typical pattern of kind of consideration, research, and then ultimately making the decision, hopefully purchasing. And so we look at that journey from excitement to confusion to frustration and hopefully that optimistic anticipation. And we map our tone accordingly to that intent. And ultimately, that leads to hopefully a more satisfactory user experience.
So another way to think about context is in the case of shopping, there are kind of different types of shopping. As I mentioned earlier, when you're shopping for stuff for your house, when you're shopping for necessity, you are probably in a very different mindset than you are when you're shopping for desire. In this case, if I were to be kind of perusing the internet for inspiration for decorating my garden of my imaginary home, you can insert probably any kind of thing that you have in your mind that you've been looking around on the internet for, that you've been really thinking about or anticipating purchasing. And that's a very different kind of contextual moment for you as a shopper. So for that reason, we have something like this, which is an example from the Google Express app. And if you look at this screen, you might not necessarily think like, oh, like a writer put time and consideration into these words because it's just purely information. But the fact is of course, they were considered and conceived of by a writer. And here, what the words and the design are doing together are really kind of just presenting and putting forth the most important information, keeping you focused on going to checkout because this is your cart page, prioritizing that what, trash bags in this case you have purchased, and also making sure that you know the most important thing, which is how do you get free delivery, which we know from research is what people care about when they're shopping online. So then back to the example from like shopping for desire. So if you are in this case on Flora Grubb's website, like something like new dazzle, like language that's a little bit more evocative or playful is probably a more appropriate to meet you in your context because you're in this kind of exploratory mode where you might be more open for this type of copy.
Indeed. So another time when we find that users are really open to a much more kind of anticipatory tone is at the travel planning stage. And in fact, there's research that shows a lot of people are happier in this mode of planning a trip than they actually are on the trip. So at this moment, it's a good time to kind of lean into that aspiration, why not? And celebrate that with beautiful language, including large format photography, which we have here, as well as descriptive text. And to Joss's point about kind of the everyday essentials example, we have kind of the counter to that, which is when you're researching a flight, perhaps it's multiple hundreds of dollars purchase, there's a lot of consideration, and therefore we really prioritize the information over kind of editorializing the copy. So the clear example here of really simplistic and straightforward text is the call to action where to. You simply enter in your destination and hopefully off you go. This feature I'm super excited to be able to work on. Why not lean into the fun part of travel? Ultimately, this is the place that we all kind of want to go in our minds. And this is a new feature called Weekend Trips. It's part of our Google Destinations product. And when I talk with my team about this type of product, we oftentimes say, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the traveler. And with that perspective, a headline like "Find inspiration for your next short adventure" makes great sense, right? These are the types of moments we can lean into that more kind of anticipatory and fun copy.
So next, we're going to talk about the importance of being consistent. So as we move through the world, part of the way that we establish consistency and therefore stability is through pattern recognition and storytelling. And this has served us well since the beginning of time. We seek out chronological events, both in the stories that we tell ourselves and the ones that we like to watch and, read. And also, starting even from when we're small children, we are learning this structure very inherently. And like, if you think about maybe some of your favorite books from childhood, oftentimes they might have like a repetition or a pattern or a cadence that helps you, potentially learn or memorize. But it also, that is so soothing because it makes you feel safe and fits familiar, and it's like starts to breed and form the circumstances for trust. So that's why consistency is so important. So then there's the example of when you break with patterns. So for me at least, since the 2016 elections, there's been a major break with patterns in terms of how we conduct our public rhetoric. I think no matter what side of the spectrum you're on politically, the way that we speak, the rhetoric that we use has kind of veered a little bit more towards like the inflammatory and the controversial than maybe in the past. And so I put these words on the screen because they have something in common in that they're all very politically charged. They're used inconsistently. People have different ideas about what they mean and when they're appropriate and when they should be said and when they should not be said. So similarly, these words are also inconsistently used, and people have, pretty polar opinions about what they mean and the weight that they carry. So this is just to kind of like stop and have a moment to reflect on the fact that the words we choose like have a powerful, sometimes even subliminal effect on their listeners and readers.
So switching to something perhaps less epic, but equally important to me, I think a lot about ads in all their formats and notations. And when we see consistency there, obviously the goal there is to breed trust. We think a lot about what are the right patterns to ensure that the user anticipates the right format at the right time. So ultimately, we're always looking to bring clarity to that label. And one of the ways we do this is through a tool that I love and hold dearly, which is called a word list. So this is basically a list of this, not that examples, what you should say, what you shouldn't say, and why.
So also, there are moments to consistently diverge from your consistency. So I wanted to kind of bring attention to these examples because, there are oftentimes when we make rules, reasons why we need to break them, and thus with language as well. I think the really important thing is being consistent in those rules that you set, even though they diverge, and also documenting why. So in this example, we're looking at two different products. It's essentially two different like booking possibilities or purchasing possibilities via Google. So with the one here, this is a search ad that would help you contract with a plumber or a contractor, and you see the words Google guaranteed highlighted. And so that is meant to give you kind of a sense of trust and that you're being taken care of by a program that's in place. And then for placing your order, you have your purchases are protected, which is kind of a little bit lighter weight. It's less specific. And this divergence, even though these things seem like they mean something similar, was very intentional because, the model of maybe like hiring a contractor from an ad that you saw on the internet is probably a little bit less familiar than the act of just like buying something online, which has become something that we're more or less familiar with. So hence the reason for something that feels more programmatized and formal versus just like a, hey, we got your back here. So next, we want to talk about style. So style is the sum of many carefully considered choices. And writing style works alongside visual style, of course, to kind of create the overall identity or experience. And I think sometimes when we think about style, the tendency is to think of like grander gestures or more overt kind of style that's flashier. But actually, it's really a lot of the subtle decisions that we make in writing that come through to really telegraph what the style is. So I want to talk about this book. I recommend it highly to anyone, even if you're curious about writing and language or not. I just found it really illuminating into just human behavior. So James W. Pennebaker he's a sociologist and anthropologist, but he chose to focus his research and his work on language. So he differentiates in language the difference between content and style words. And the bulk of language, as you can see, are content words. And they studied a lot of, this is English, but they also studied many like commonly spoken languages around the world. And this breakdown actually holds across these languages. And so style words, he calls them social words because he says that these are the words that kind of give us really an indication of relationships and like people's true intent and the things that they might not necessarily be saying overtly with their content words. And these are like the smaller words, the ones that are really easy to forget about. But like as writers, I think these are the ones that are the most strategic, that oftentimes should be the most considered and have a really huge impact on changing the meaning. So as an example, he shows these two sentences. And as you see, if you swap out the article, the sentence has a very different meaning in each case. And like depending on your cultural background and your relationship status and even like your mood for the day or just like whatever tone you're assuming the speaker to have, you might read something very different from each of these sentences if you change that article. So he also, as the title implies, he talks a lot about pronoun use. So apparently people who are lower in status use more of the I pronoun than people who are high status. And he defines high and low as like the relationship between a student and a teacher or like a report and a boss, or it could just be like someone who's asking for something versus someone who has the power to grant that thing. And so he talks about how I is also correlated to Like if you are going through a period of depression or feeling especially introspective or just looking inward and reflecting on yourself, people who are in that kind of emotional state tend to use I more because they're reflecting on and they're trying to communicate themselves to the world. Whereas if you are higher status or feeling more confident, you might feel better about saying you and addressing people directly, or by kind of grouping yourselves with the greater community with we or they.
Yes, so I was super taken by the same book, and we were comparing notes, and one of the sections talked about the fact that in a previous presidential election, some of the speeches were analyzed, and George W. Bush came across as folksy, and John Kerry came across as wooden, and it was very much attributed to their pronoun use. So beware. And I was reminded while sitting and watching TV, one of my favorite series, The Crown on Netflix, the Queen went to a Jaguar factory and was talking to the nation from there. And she spoke on behalf of the whole country and said we. And she talked about the lowly factory worker as you. And she did not mean to intend that derisive and condescending tone, but unfortunately, that's the way it came across. And this harkens back to an earlier slide that Josh shared, but it only underscores the importance that public figures have when they speak. And I would say, similarly, we as language experts, as designers, as writers, oftentimes writing to thousands, if not millions of people, also should really think about the weight of those word choices. And on a slightly lighter note and less words note, we think a lot about this, and a couple very tactical and tangible examples currently in the works right now are in our Google Pay and our shopping products. So recently announced that we have a new payments product coming out called Google Pay, and one of the call to actions is pay with Google Pay. The notion of adding with as the preposition is that it's very much a conjoined action of sign in plus credentials equals safe, secure payments. And then the buy on Google, got to get my verb straight, is very much intentional because you're purchasing on shopping rather than getting sent over to a merchant site. So again, very deliberate and tiny, tiny words, but they really matter. Another way to kind of think about how you can bring some voice and some kind of positive attitude or outlook to your products is with empty states. A lot of us end up designing for empty states, and they'll say something like, nothing here to see. And that's pretty obvious and not super helpful. So one idea is to put something positive and perhaps give them an incentive. This great example from AdMob is a really nice one in that it's got illustration, it's got a nice headline, it's got a congratulatory tone, and ultimately we think we'll see more people uploading their first report. So kind of bringing it home, putting it into practice, hopefully some good tips for you to bring back to your work. So my really big call out here is design language systems have language in them. And oftentimes we find design language systems leave out the language. So my PSA here is let's put the language back in design language systems. And I think the good news is we're seeing some of that. We saw this really interesting Envision report tool that came out recently, this Design Systems Handbook. They point to a lot of externally available resources, including Google style guides, as well as Airbnb and Salesforce. And the lovely thing about the style guide is it does incorporate a lot of component parts that I think a lot of you would find really helpful. In addition, props to them in that they call out leveraging a content strategist or writer for the tone and voice section. Speaking of tone and voice, I love this MailChimp tone and voice guide. It's kind of a perennial favorite. Envision cites it, but it's definitely one that you guys should check out if you haven't already. It's broadly applicable. It's available to everyone, and ultimately is a style guide about copy, which is really refreshing. And here's our material design guidelines. We've got a great writing style section within that, lots of great do's and don'ts. And this is just one of many component parts of any good style guide, right? And certainly from a language standpoint, some of the components that we like to see are guidelines like this. We definitely want to see word lists, we want to see tone maps, and ultimately some component parts like call to actions and help text. So an example of a tone map is something that we do a lot in commerce in particular, where we plot the tonal spectrum of a particular journey. So you think about kind of a warm welcome or an onboarding flow. That might be more at the kind of congratulatory end of the spectrum. Whereas when you get into kind of a late delivery email situation, that might be more on the reassuring side. So again, just making sure you're really intentional about plotting your tone is something that can then make your voice sound really consistent and ultimately your brand more recognizable. I love this material design illustration of the many component parts that create an experience. And the big headline here is that the user experience is an end-to-end journey. So all of the component parts really need to come together in the end. And that's why these guidelines can be really helpful. You need to consider, of course, the email, the design of the site itself, as well as all the touch points along the way.
Okay. So, I mean, I really think of writing as a process of kind of breathing life into an idea. And, writing is hard. And that isn't a reason to not do it necessarily. This is a quote from Anne Lamott's essay, Shitty First Drafts, which I will subsequently also reference. But it's kind of a nice call to action or invitation to not have imposter syndrome and just go ahead and do it and get it out there, because it's really can help in the formative process of bringing your ideas into fruition. So, at the outset of any project, it's probably, the value of kind of abstracted or pulled back wireframes is, of course, pretty obvious as designers. But I feel like when you start to get in and get a little bit more specific about what you're designing, leaving the words off is really doing a disservice to your process. And even if they're kind of scrappily written in, and just having the actual information in there and the ideas will probably help determine or help make you choose a different decision about how the interactions should come together. Just seeing that information in place, I think, is really powerful. So, these next couple of techniques that I'm going to go over, I'm calling them narrative wireframes, because I think they give you kind of a design thinking way to start out, similar to a wireframe, but instead of being visual, they are more verbal. So the first one is a narrative PRD. And so at Google, we use the term PRD, which is a product requirements doc, quite frequently. And usually the product manager writes this, and it's often filled with the business case and a lot of technical terms and some technical spec. And it's, very useful at the inception of any project, but I also find it really helpful to write my version of the Shitty First Draft, which is my narrative PRD, which is essentially just, okay, what's the story of what we're building in my words? Let me just write it out. I've got it. So kind of a little bit more polished version of that is writing a future press release, and this one isn't new. I think it's been talked about and done in a lot of companies, but it really helps kind of take that to a step further, because when you have to think about how people are going to talk about your product when it launches, how you would explain it to press, to your mom, you have to start to choose actual words. You can't fall back on the code words or the acronyms or the shorthand. You have to actually assign certain values to what you're building, and maybe come up with an elevator pitch, a way to explain it really concisely. And the last one is conversation mapping, which is essentially kind of role playing out loud. And so myself and a designer on my team, we did this exercise together, and I found it really eye-opening, actually. And basically, I and he took turns playing the role of the assistant and the user and kind of designing or setting up a shopping onboarding flow. And when you have an actual conversation, first of all, what comes to light are how much information and complexity is there that we didn't initially think was going to be part of this setup. And then the second thing is tone becomes really important, and you realize, okay, if I'm asking for something kind of sensitive or personal as the assistant, I started to feel a little sheepish. And I realized that in exchange for that information, I need to therefore then give back something about how I'm going to use your data, like why this is okay and why I need it. So kind of figuring out like those junctures for tone and also information, that it really helped by just having an actual conversation. Okay, so we're going to end with a little poetry analysis because I think of poetry as the ultimate in designed language. And I have the title and the name of the poet and also a link on the screen because I want to be respectful of the fact that I wasn't able to attain permissions in time to show the poem. So if you have your device, I would invite you. You can Google it and follow along. I'm just going to read some excerpts and talk a little bit about how they're salient to our talk today. So Michael Palmer is one of the language poets, and a language poetry, it emphasizes the reader's role in bringing out meaning in a work. So I love this poem because it has a rhythm that builds throughout, and he uses the repetition of the phrase, "I do not know English," ironically, because the poem is obviously in English. And his intent is to help us identify with an immigrant experience. So I'm going to read a few stanzas. I do not know English. I do not know English, and therefore I can have nothing to say about this latest war, flowering through a nightscope in the evening sky. I do not know English, and therefore when hungry can do no more than repeatedly point to my mouth. So each stanza elaborates upon an idea or social cue that the speaker is unable to communicate because of his lack of language. However, toward the end of the poem, the references become stranger, and indeed they start to seem foreign themselves. So he's using the language to invert the experience from what could have been read as a first-person account of a foreigner to putting the reader actually in the shoes of the traveler in the foreign land. And I read from the poem again. Because I do not know English, I have variously been called Mr. Twisted, the one undone, the non-respondent, the truly lost boy, and laughed at by horses. The war is declared ended almost before it has begun. They have named it the ultimate combat between nearness and distance. It's the ultimate combat between nearness and distance. I highlight this phrase in particular because I feel like that as designers considered of language, it means being cognizant of nearness and distance and to really think about the relationship that you want to establish with your audience or your user. And that could be one of closeness and intimacy, or it could be one that's kind of hands-off. Or it could be one that's, anywhere in the middle of that spectrum, but, all of those choices are okay depending on the scenario for which you're designing. So I hope that we've given you some new ways to kind of think about these relationships that you are establishing and the language choices that you'll make to do so. So thank you so much.
You have a design language phrases and styles that you control yourself, and you have a design language that you work within, the material design, buttons and visual cues.
Yep.
Do you find the constraints put upon you by the group that you don't control to be helpful so you can get through those conversations that would never end about the shade of the button? Or do you find them to be too constraining and you wish you had more influence over that group so you could accomplish the thing you're trying to accomplish?
So in essence, we have a design system at Google at large called material design. And we, as content strategists and UXers, have our own design system, perhaps for our respective product areas. How do we coexist nicely? Fair? Okay, cool. So the good thing about Google is we're super collaborative. So if a new system is being designed, all the critical parties, I should use air quotes for that, important kind of key product areas would get check-ins so we can influence and hopefully shape that ultimate system. That being said, to your point, guardrails are there for a reason. It gives us structure, it gives us consistency, it can breed that cohesive pattern that we're all looking for. So I personally like to live within those boundaries. I have so many unsolved problems that when I can seize the opportunity to use one of the fab buttons for my call to action text, and know that there's a character count constraint, I'm totally cool with that. I would say it gets a little more challenging if, for instance, you want to go and localize that and you don't want the constraint of the fab. But we have workarounds. Typically a system is somewhat meant to be adapted, so we oftentimes have kind of a fallback plan. And the last thing I'd say is it depends on the product area for sure, but we find that within my area, which is commerce, it's a critical business function, so we oftentimes create kind of sub patterns within that. So typically works out pretty well. Any thoughts on your end?
No, I think that's well said. I mean, there is some flexibility within the system, I find. And yeah, I mean, of course, the consistency is important, but there are different use cases across different products where they've made it work for their particular, unique attributes. So, yeah.
So I really like to talk. My question is about style and about this is what I think about when I also write my blogs and my tweets, and I try to figure out what is the style and the personality of this brand that I want to convey. How do I do that, and how do I any tips on? I know we covered pronouns and stuff. I hate to check on the grammar that level, but if you can give me some guidelines on how I can better express and my style becomes clear to the audience from my blogs and stuff like that, would be great.
So for something like a blog where a tone of voice is really important, how do you define that, and what are some process tips therein? Correct? Perfect. Well, I have a workshop that I actually lead. I'm not going to sell it right here, but I run it in my team, and I think about it a lot. And I really think about tone and voice as the way that you want to feel. How do you want your user to feel when they're reading your copy or experiencing your brand? And so there's kind of a design thinking framework called Feel, Think, Do, where you can take the user through that, or interpret the user's kind of feelings through that framework. That's one way to do it. You can write in first person and really kind of personify your user, and then think about which characteristics most relate to that person, so that you end up with attributes that personify your brand, right? So I think it's a really helpful exercise to do and to document really actionable characteristics. So for voice, something like direct is extremely actionable, right? You'll use, kind of straightforward call to action text. For something like whimsical, you have a very, kind of the polar end of the spectrum with respect to a more kind of buoyant personality, right? So I think doing that in a thoughtful way, documenting it, and ultimately, it's your brand. So you want your visuals to align with that. It's ultimately the persona and the personality that you come to be known for. So yeah, there's a few techniques like that I've used. Anything else that comes to mind on your end?
I mean, I would just say and I don't know much about your blog and your platform and what you write about, but if it's coming from you, and if it's the publisher, and it's kind of disembodied, or if it's coming from you, I think it's coming from you. Okay, I mean, I think it made me think of when you were talking about conversational design being such a paradigm now, and I mean, I think that writing how you talk, especially when you are writing from your personal perspective, is sometimes a valuable exercise. Would I speak to my friend like that? Is that the type of relationship that you even want to strike up with your readers? I mean, if it's something more formal, then maybe you would have to think about that reader persona as someone else. But I mean, I think staying true to your voice, since you have that luxury, is often it's harder than said.
The last thing I'd say is look at a lot of different sites or experiences that you enjoy. And I try to kind of, do you know what a 2x2 is? It's kind of the crosshairs. I try to plot those on a 2x2 and try to kind of get a sense of, okay, if whimsical is one end of the spectrum and straightforward is at the other end, where does this voice align that I'm kind of being gravitated toward? And then you might find where you kind of want to sit in that spectrum. Yeah, it's an interesting exercise for sure.
Hi, I was just curious. I know that, just in the past couple of years, design and people's feelings around what's correct UX design is always constantly changing and evolving, and the way that we use language, even as a society, changes every year. We're adding, new words to the dictionary. And so I was wondering, as such a large organization, how often are you looking at your brand voice, and how are you letting that evolve the way that we think about design constantly evolving and adapting for users?
As a company and as society evolves, how often do we evaluate our tone of voice and our brand voice for the company? So I feel really lucky to say that I got to work on our first brand voice documentation at Google, and it was one that was born out of a lot of great material that already existed. So it was one of those kind of pivot points, I think, in the company. This was about 3 years ago, where we were seeing more kind of end-to-end experiences, and our products needed to not kind of stop and start, frankly, at the edge of each product. And so that was somewhat the impetus, bringing on a couple new end-to-end experiences like Google Store, where we had hardware and we had software, and it was all coming together. So we really worked on brand guidelines from both from voice and photography style and visual standpoint. So that was a big inflection point. I would say, to Joss's point about conversation design, I feel like we're going through it again. We do have tenets around useful, honest human. Those are kind of perennial, universal voice tenets at Google. But I think with conversation design, some of those are being ratcheted up even further. And so I think this will be another good moment for us to kind of pause and reconcile, because the spoken word as well as the text-based words need to coexist. So we're workshopping that a lot as we go. But yeah, I definitely don't have a reminder set. I probably should. I would say it's probably something we need to do care and feeding of like every 2 years would probably be about right. I think just the way trends are going too, you have to just be really kind of sensitive to when those inflection points happen. Any other questions?
Anyone else?
What does workshopping that mean? Workshopping the tone and voice guidelines. So basically working with partners in the company and figuring out where they're struggling with some voice definition and where I'm struggling and where can we find alignment. So really just kind of sitting in a room together and showing yes and no examples and saying, are there some areas where we can find common ground, or should we diverge, and why? So basically just a crit format, just sharing work. Well, thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I'm going to pay attention to pronouns more carefully now in the future. All right, hopefully you'll join us next month for Design is Invisible. The best UI is no UI. So stay tuned for that invite soon. Thank you all.